Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Gambling Did You Know session. So today we're going to be talking about how gambling actually affects the brain. So we're going to start by just kind of looking at the brain in general, discussing, how it works a little bit, and then we'll kind of put gambling into it, and then talk about some other processes that happens a lot of time when it comes to people who do gamble. So starting off a little bit of basics of the brain. This is not an anatomy or a physiology lesson necessarily, but I think it is important to understand how our brains work, at least to a certain extent, especially when it comes to something like gambling that can affect our brains. So our brains are kind of made up of nerve cells, at least in part of nerve cells. These are called neurons. And these neurons kind of act in a couple different ways. They exchange electrical charges across a single neuron, and then also chemical signals when maybe they can't be reached with an electrical charge. So this is basically due to the stimuli that they receive. So whenever a stimulus occurs, something like you stub your toe or your name is called, basically our brain is processing that information, and then it's going to be sending messages across our brain that's going to affect our body and affect how we actually react to that stimuli. So naturally, when you stub your toe, your reaction might be to say ow, or to kind of grab your toe or something like that. When your name is called, your reaction might be to turn to where you hear that coming from. But this is happening because of how our brains are working. They're processing that information and sending these messages across. So these neurons are actually not touching each other. They're actually separated by gaps called synapses. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a minute. But basically, this is important because the electrical message that's being sent can't actually pass across this synapse. It can't actually pass in between this gap between these cells. So instead, that's where those chemical signals come into play. There's a message that is sent by the neurons to release these chemical messengers, and these can actually go in between that gap in that synapse. So that is how kind of our brain is sending messages from one cell or one neuron to another neuron. So this kind of, I think, factors in here because the reward circuit of the brain is important when it comes to gambling and other processes like it. So the limbic system, this is one part of the brain, and one part of the limbic system is kind of that reward circuit of our brain. So this is going to regulate, how we feel pleasure, or, what feels good to us, things like that. So when this specific circuit is activated, basically each cell or each neuron in this circuit is going to release dopamine. This is one of those chemical messengers, or it's called a neurotransmitter again. So this is going to be released into that synapse or gap between these cells. So this neurotransmitter, this dopamine, is then going to bind to a receptor on the next neuron. And that is actually what's going to cause a person to feel pleasure, or to feel positive or good about what just happened. And then this, in turn, our reaction to this, just like how we would, turn to the sound of someone calling our name, we're going to feel pleasure here, but that's actually going to motivate us to repeat the behaviors that led to us feeling good in this case. So just to look, before we move on to the next part of this, just to look again at what a neuron actually kind of looks like. Each one of these, this blue one and this green one, these are different neurons. So it's kind of like a tree, I guess you could say. And then down to the kind of the roots of this one, you can see this is where the synapse is. So kind of this yellow circle, these two cells aren't actually touching. They're not actually overlapping. So there's a little space in between there. That's the synapse. But again, this cell here would be sending this message all the way from kind of these, you could say leaves, I guess, all the way down to kind of the roots down here to the next cell. So looking at this a little bit closer, what that synapse actually looks like, again, it's very small right here, but this is kind of zoomed in a lot more. So we do have these neurotransmitters that are found in this first neuron, the sending neuron here, and they're actually being released into this gap here, which will then bind to that receptor like we talked about, and then have that effect. So, it's kind of important to realize how this process works, not only because the brain does change throughout our lives, but again, the brain is affected by gambling. So when we think about our brain, when we're born, it's not fully developed. And this is something that I think a lot of people have come to realize over the years. Our brains aren't fully developed usually until about our mid-20s. But it's a good thing kind of that our brains aren't fully developed when we're born, because that means they can be adaptable. We can adapt to different things, different focuses that we kind of build on, and different experiences that we have. So a 2-year-old, actually, this is kind of interesting to me, that a 2-year-old has about 50% more synapses than an adult. So more of these kind of different gaps, these different processes. What usually is going to happen is there's going to be some sort of synaptic pruning. So just like, if you have a plant and it's growing and it's kind of growing outward like this, you probably want to prune some of those, branches and things like that, because if you just kind of let it grow like this, it's not going to grow as big and as strong. You need to kind of remove the weaker parts of the plant to make sure that your nutrients and your resources are getting to, the best, strongest part of the plant. That's just going to make it healthier for the plant. The same thing happens with our brain. We need to kind of prune different pieces of these synapses and things, so that our brain can be more effective in the long run as we age. So again, our teen brain, when we're talking about teens, this is still, growing. This process is still happening, that pruning process. But it's also a great time for a person to learn and to continue to kind of work on these changes and grow. So that is another reason why gambling can be really effective in a negative way. It can have a large effect on the teen brain, is just because this process is happening. If a person gets into gambling when they are young, like a teenager or even before that, this is going to have that stronger process. It's going to be taking up some of those resources that other, potentially more important processes could have. So we're finally getting to talking about gambling and the brain itself. So one thing I think we need to understand, and most people probably do, is that gambling is inherently a risky behavior. That does not necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but you are dealing with risks. Any kind of gambling is involving risks. So you're usually, taking a risk, you're wagering something of value. Many times that is money. Sometimes it's not money, but you're putting something at risk. You could potentially win something that's more important or something of greater value, but you also could lose what you wagered. You could lose something as well. So that does make this a risky behavior. And when we do gamble, this whole process of that dopamine being released, that is occurring anytime a person is gambling. So a person is probably going to be feeling good when they're gambling, because it can be that exciting feeling. It can be an exciting process, to be involved in. But what's important about gambling is you don't even have to win for this response to occur. Even when you're losing money, this reward system is still being activated. You're still probably feeling good in a way. So that is kind of leading us to why is gambling potentially dangerous for the brain. Again, when a person is gambling, this process is happening, but especially when they win, there's kind of a larger amount of dopamine being released. What that means is that the person is going to feel kind of that rush, a really positive experience. They're going to have a great time, which makes sense if they're winning money. But the more that a person does this, the more their brain is kind of going to actually start to build a tolerance to that dopamine that they receive. So our reward circuit in our brain, with things like gambling, with things like substance use, it can become overused, and can actually lead to a person, feeling kind of dull just in average life. So they're not getting that same rush or excitement from normal activities. They need to be taking more risks. They need to be gambling more to see that same effect. And research has actually pointed to this when we look at people who have gambling problems, who are struggling with gambling. A lot of times they're gambling in order to feel normal or to get that rush, not so much to focus on the gambling itself or focus on that money aspect. A lot of times they're focusing on just feeling normal. And that's, again, definitely a problematic place to be because this can set a person up for a lot of problems continually. And there's other important things to consider that research also points to. Some people are kind of genetically predisposed to thrill-seeking behaviors or impulsive actions involving things oftentimes like gambling and substance use. So someone can actually be predisposed for problems related to these, just how our brains work. So some people, while our brains work pretty much in the same way, we all have different brains, different bodies, and some people might be more susceptible to this problem. Other things, some kind of communities and groups almost consider problem gambling a common pastime. So gambling can be just basically so ingrained in some kind of cultures or some people, some groups, that's going to make it harder to recognize that there is a problem. So with this in mind, we want to kind of think about what else is happening, what other processes are going on with a person's brain. So a couple unhelpful thought processes that are commonly held or found among people who gamble. The first one is something that we've talked about in the past, and this is the gambler's fallacy. So this is kind of the belief that if there's a certain outcome that occurs more frequently than normal, it's going to be less likely to happen in the future, or vice versa. So for example, a person may stay on a slot machine for hours because they believe that it's about to pay out. It hasn't paid out in a long time. So they believe that, they're going to win money. They have to stay and continue to gamble here. Similarly, but a little bit different, if, a person is flipping coins, they're betting on this, if it has flipped up for heads 4 times in a row, they believe the next one is going to be tails. Or kind of even vice versa, they believe that the next one is going to be heads because the last 4 have been heads. So this is kind of 2 sides to the gambler's fallacy. Both of these are incorrect. It still comes down to a 50-50 chance with that coin flip. And we do know that slot machines are random number generators. So it doesn't, matter when it last paid out. It's completely random there. So that is the gambler's fallacy there. Another harmful belief that many people hold is illusion of control. And this can happen in a couple different ways as well. So basically here, a person believes that they have some sort of control over this outcome that they really don't. It's an uncontrollable outcome for them. Maybe they think they have some sort of special skills or knowledge that's going to give them an advantage. This is where you can see superstitions come into gambling and things like that as well. So for example, a person may wear a lucky jersey on game day so that the team he bets on wins, differently, but kind of still that illusion of control. A person who picks numbers for their lottery ticket feels more confident they will win than if they got an easy pick or something like that. So again, this is not true at all. It comes down to random numbers once again, but we can feel more confident just because we had some illusion of control. We were picking those numbers and we think that that's going to help us win. So I think we talked enough about the brain today and different processes that many people can have related to gambling. I do want to share some additional resources here. So please feel free to reach out to any of these places, these resources. If you or someone you know is interested in just finding out more information, or you're looking for treatment resources, anything like that, these are great places to start. So thank you everybody for tuning in as usual, and we'll see you next time with another Gambling Did You Know session.